Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take all the fascinating sources you send us and really dig in to find the key insights, maybe some surprising bits of knowledge.
Exactly. The idea is to get you well informed, but, without making it feel like homework.
Right. And today we're diving into something pretty counterintuitive. We're looking at how sometimes what seems like a big advantage isn't.
And how things that look like disadvantages can actually turn out to be strengths. We've got some really compelling material to work through.
Yeah, the mission today is basically to explore these situations where the underdog wins or where our usual ideas about power and resources just don't quite hold up.
And it doesn't matter if you know these specific stories already or not. We think there are valuable perspectives here for everyone.
Okay, let's jump right in with maybe the most famous underdog story ever. David and Goliath.
Yes. And the sources remind us there's more to it than just, courage versus size.
So set the scene for us. We're talking 11th century BCE.
That's right. The Philistines, they were originally from Crete, seafaring people. They're pushing into Israelite land, Elah Valley.
And you've got the two armies, King Saul's Israelites on one ridge, Philistines on the other. A standoff.
Until Goliath steps out, the Philistine champion. And he is huge. I mean, the descriptions say at least 6'9".
Wow.
Covered head to toe in bronze armor, carrying a javelin, a massive spear, a sword. Even has a guy carrying a shield for him.
And he makes that classic challenge, right? Single combat, winner takes all.
Exactly. If he wins, Israelites become slaves. If the Israelite champion wins, Philistines become slaves. High stakes.
And the Israelites are, understandably, terrified. Nobody wants to volunteer.
Completely frozen. Until David shows up. He's just a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, supposed to be bringing lunch for his brothers.
And he volunteers, just like that.
Yeah. Saul the king is like, whoa, kid, you can't fight this guy. You're too young. He's a warrior.
Makes sense.
But David insists. He talks about how he's fought off lions and bears, protecting his flock. He's got confidence.
So he goes out there. What's Goliath's reaction?
Pure scorn. He sees this young shepherd approaching and is basically insulted. Like, is this the best you've got?
Okay, but here's where our sources add that crucial layer. It's about the type of warrior.
Precisely. Back then, you basically had three kinds of fighters. Cavalry guys on horseback.
Right.
Infantry, the heavy foot soldiers like Goliath, decked out in armor, fighting up close.
Okay.
And then you had projectile warriors, the artillery, archers, and, importantly here, slingers.
Ah, and David was a shepherd. Slinging stones was his thing.
Exactly. He wasn't going down there to fight Goliath hand-to-hand, infantry versus infantry. That would be suicide.
He was going as a projectile warrior.
Yes, and think about it. No heavy armor means he's fast, he can move. Goliath is basically a slow-moving tank.
So David picks up some stones, puts one in his sling.
Swings it, builds up speed, aiming for Goliath's forehead. Apparently the only spot not covered by armor.
And the physics of a sling are actually pretty potent, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. One ballistics expert, Eaton Hirsch, calculated this stuff. A good slinger, using a typical stone at about 35 meters.
Which is pretty far.
Right. Could hit Goliath's head at something like 34 meters per second.
Wow. What's that equivalent to?
The stopping power of a fair-sized modern handgun. So this isn't just chucking a pebble.
And it would have been fast.
Incredibly fast. He could potentially hit Goliath in just over a second, before the giant could even properly react or close the distance.
David even sort of points this out, doesn't he?
Right.
Mentioning Goliath's sword and spear, but saying his approach is different.
He does, and he frames it as the battle belonging to God, not weapons. But the really surprising insight here is that if you were watching from the ridges and you understood ancient warfare, you'd know David was a slinger.
Yeah.
And you'd see this heavily armored, slow infantryman.
You wouldn't necessarily think David was the underdog.
Probably not. Slingers had a documented advantage over infantry. They could strike from a distance before the infantry could even engage.
So the whole story gets flipped. It's not just about courage. It's about tactics, understanding your strengths and exploiting your opponent's weaknesses.
Exactly. What looked like David's disadvantage, his lack of armor and conventional weapons, was actually his key advantage. He didn't play Goliath's game.
That really sets up this whole idea we're exploring, how disadvantages can be strengths.
It perfectly illustrates it, and it leads nicely into another story, a much more modern one.
Right, the basketball team. Vivek Ranadive.
Yeah, coaching his daughter's team. These were, as he put it, little blonde girls. daughters of tech guys, basically.
Nerds and computer programmers, no real basketball background.
Zero. And they're playing against teams with passionate, experienced players who'd been playing for years.
Seems like another mismatch. So what was Ranadiv's secret weapon?
Well, his background matters. He came to the U.S. as a teenager, an immigrant, and he apparently just hated losing. He wasn't bound by conventional basketball wisdom. His strategy was simple, but radical. A nonstop, aggressive, full-court press. From the second the game started, every single game.
All the time.
Wow.
That's unusual, especially for young teams.
Totally unconventional. And the result?
They did well.
They made it to the national championships, this team of beginners.
That's incredible. How did the press work so well?
His daughter, Anjali, explained it. The constant pressure just made the other teams nervous. They panicked.
Led to mistakes.
Lots of steals. And because they were pressing full court, the steals often happened near the opponent's basket. So easy layups for Ranadiv's team.
Ah, so they didn't even need to be great shooters.
Exactly. They bypassed that whole skill set. They'd often jump out to these huge early leads, 4-0, 8-0, 12-0, one time even 25-0.
Wow. Just overwhelming them from the start.
Yeah. There's even a story where they only had 4 players available for a game.
Oh.
But they still played the full court press, and they only lost by 3 points.
That's commitment to the strategy.
It really shows its power. And our source connects this to Rick Pitino, the college coach.
Right. He used the press effectively, too, didn't he?
Yeah, with teams at Boston University and Providence that weren't considered super talented. He took them way further in the NCAA tournament than anyone expected, almost to the championship game with Providence, using that same kind of relentless pressure.
So it's a proven, if unconventional, tactic.
Definitely. Ranadive tells this story about a game where they were just dominating a much more experienced team, like 20-0.
20-0.
Because of the press.
Mm-hmm.
And the other coach just lost it, started screaming. It shows the psychological impact. You just don't expect that from a team you think you should beat easily.
Which brings us back to that core idea again, right? What we think is an advantage maybe isn't.
Exactly. The experienced team had the skills, the supposed advantage, but Ranadive's team used speed, pressure, the element of surprise things that weren't conventional advantages to totally disrupt them.
It forces you to question those basic assumptions about what makes a team or anyone successful.
Precisely. Size, resources, experience, they matter, of course, but maybe not always in the way we think. Unconventional strategies, playing to niche strengths, that can be incredibly powerful.
Okay, let's shift gears.
Mm-hmm.
Still on this theme of challenging conventional wisdom, but now in education. Class size.
Right. The source talks about Sheppog Valley Middle School in a pretty wealthy area of Connecticut.
And they had declining enrollment, which led to really small classes.
Yeah, like 15 students sometimes, which is way below the national average.
And the gut feeling, the common sense idea is that smaller is better, right? More attention per kid.
Absolutely. I mean, the source says something like 77% of Americans think smaller classes are more important than, say, higher teacher salaries. It just feels right.
In Connecticut, having lots of these small schools kind of became a natural place to see if that holds true.
So economists looked at data, not just Connecticut, but data from 18 different countries.
And what did they find? Was smaller always better?
Surprisingly, no. They found non-trivial beneficial effects. So real positive impacts only in Greece and Iceland.
Only 2 countries, despite all the focus and money poured into this.
Yeah, especially in the U.S., huge investment, hiring like 250,000 new teachers between 96 and 2004. Spending went way up, but the widespread benefit wasn't really showing up in the data.
So the supposed advantage wasn't delivering as expected.
And then you get the perspective from Teresa DeBrito, a middle school principal. She was actually worried about classes being too small.
Worried about them being too small. Why?
Especially for middle schoolers. You know, that awkward, self-conscious stage, anxious about speaking up, worried about looking too smart or not smart enough. Her concern was that if the class is too tiny, you don't get that critical mass of different voices, different personalities. Discussions can fall flat.
Less energy, less engagement.
Yeah. Students might feel too exposed, like they have a muzzle on, as she put it. She actually preferred the energy of a larger group, like an audience, over a tiny team.
That's a really interesting perspective, that critical mass matters.
And Professor James Levin echoes this. He argued that cutting class sizes too much actually steals away the peers that struggling students learn from.
So peer interaction is a key part of learning, not just teacher attention.
Right. Which leads us to this other really fascinating concept. The big fish little pond effect.
Okay, what's that?
Basically, the idea is that the more elite and competitive the school or university, the big pond, the worse students tend to feel about their own academic abilities compared to their peers.
Even if they're objectively very smart.
Yes. The source gives the example of Caroline Sachs. She was a top student in high school, did great at community college. Then she goes to Brown University, a very selective Ivy League school.
Okay, a big pond.
A very big pond. And she hits organic chemistry. Works incredibly hard, harder than ever before, but she struggles. Really struggles compared to the other students there.
And how did that affect her?
She described feeling this overwhelming inadequacy. It crushed her confidence, and ultimately, she gave up her dream of pursuing science.
Wow. So the prestige of the institution, the very thing that seems like an advantage, actually undermined her.
In her case, yes, because her relative standing plummeted. This ties into Stouffer's idea of relative deprivation.
Which is?
We judge ourselves based on who's around us, our local comparison group. People in the same boat, as the source puts it, not some abstract global standard.
Like the example of potentially higher suicide rates in happy countries.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're depressed, you feel even more out of step.
Exactly. So in education, how you feel about your abilities, your academic self-concept, is shaped by the classroom you're in. And that feeling dictates how willing you are to tackle hard things.
So being a big fish in a little pond might actually be better for your confidence and persistence than being a little fish in a big pond, even if that pond is Harvard.
That's the argument. The source contrasts Harvard drags smart kids near the bottom at Harvard with Hartwick all-stars, maybe less stellar students overall, but top of their class at a less selective school like Hartwick.
And the Hartwick all-stars might actually do better in the long run.
They might be more likely to stick with challenging fields like science because they feel smart relative to their peers. It's about that feeling of competence.
Are there numbers to back this up?
Yeah, some striking research. Mitchell Chang found that for every 10-point decrease in a university's average SAT score.
Decrease.
Yeah, decrease. The likelihood of a student graduating with a STEM degree actually increases by 2 percentage points.
That's completely counterintuitive.
It is. It suggests that for Caroline Sachs, choosing Brown over, say, the University of Maryland, which was mentioned as having a 150-point lower average SAT, might have cost her a 30% lower chance of finishing with that science degree she wanted, even though STEM jobs are in demand.
So the better school wasn't necessarily better for her in achieving her goal.
It seems not. And this effect shows up elsewhere, too, like in economics PhD programs.
How so?
Research found that the very best PhD students from schools outside the top 30 often ended up with more publications than even very strong students, like 80th percentile at elite places like Harvard, MIT, Stanford.
So, again, the big fish from the smaller pond potentially outperforming, it raises the question for employers. Mm-hmm. Who do you hire?
Right. The star from the tiny pond might actually be a better bet sometimes.
Did elite schools ever recognize this problem?
Harvard apparently did, way back in the 60s. An admissions director named Fred Glimp noticed this demoralizing effect on students not at the very top.
The happy bottom quarter policy.
That's the one. The idea was to consciously admit some students, like gifted athletes, who might have slightly lower academic scores, but could find success and fulfillment in other areas, providing an alternative path besides pure academic competition.
Interesting. And this whole concept has implications for things like affirmative action, too.
It does. Richard Sanders' research on law schools suggested that because of affirmative action aiming to get students into the best schools possible, a significant number of African-American law students ended up in the bottom 10% or 20% of their class at those elite schools.
Creating that potential mismatch effect again, like Caroline Sachs.
Exactly. Raising concerns about demoralization and whether that's actually the best path. Sanders' surprising conclusion was that for Black students aiming to become practicing lawyers, not attending the absolute top-ranked school they got into could actually lead to better outcomes, higher graduation rates, better bar passage rates, more actually practicing law.
Wow. That really turns the conventional advice on its head.
It really does. It hammers home this central idea. Our definition of what constitutes an advantage just isn't always right. We make mistakes thinking about underdogs, and we underestimate the freedom that can come from what looks like a disadvantage.
The little pond can actually maximize opportunity for some.
We even hear from Stephen Randolph, another guy who was top of his class, near perfect scores, goes to Harvard, starts strong, then hits quantum mechanics, gets his first B-, and suddenly feels like maybe he's not cut out for it, not good enough. that one relative failure can shake your whole trajectory.
It reminds me of the Impressionists you mentioned earlier.
Yes. Artistic geniuses who realized the prestigious salon, the Big Pond, had limitations, maybe wasn't the best place for their radical new work. So they created their own little pond independent exhibitions.
Taking control of the context.
And there's Carol Graham's research on happiness, the paradox of happy peasants and miserable millionaires.
Right, where relative position matters more than absolute wealth sometimes. Being poor in Honduras might feel different than being poor in Chile, depending on who you're comparing yourself to.
It all points to the power of context and relative comparison.
Okay, so we've thoroughly explored how perceived advantages can be tricky. Let's flip it now. What about disadvantages? The things we normally try to avoid at all costs.
Right. Conventional wisdom says, disadvantage, avoid. Avoid. But the sources introduce this really interesting concept from psychologists Robert and Elizabeth York. Desirable difficulties.
Desirable difficulties. Sounds like an oxymoron.
It does. But the idea is that certain kinds of difficulties, things that make learning harder in the short term, can actually lead to better long-term learning and performance.
How did that work?
They force you to engage more deeply, to struggle, to develop compensatory strategies. It's not just passive absorption.
The source uses those brain teasers, right?
Yeah.
The bat and ball costs $1.10.
Yeah, and the widget machine riddle. Our first easy intuitive answer is often wrong.
The bat costs $1, the ball costs 10 cents. Nope.
Right. You have to stop, think harder, override that initial impulse. That effortful processing is the desirable difficulty. It makes the learning stickier.
Okay, so how does this play out in real life? The source gives the example of David Boies,
the world-famous trial lawyer, who has dyslexia. He struggled profoundly with reading.
Which seems like, well, a massive disadvantage for a lawyer. The profession is built on reading.
You'd think it would be disqualifying. But Boies is a prime example of someone turning a difficulty into something desirable, or at least manageable, through compensation.
How did he manage?
First, he went to a small pond for College University of Redlands, where he could excel. Then, he cleverly applied to law school early, skipping some core undergrad courses that were reading intensive.
Strategic.
Very. In law school, since reading was laborious, he couldn't rely on reading every single word of every case. He got good at reading summaries, and crucially, he developed extraordinary listening skills and memory.
Because he had to. He couldn't just rely on notes like everyone else.
Exactly. He had to listen intently in class, process it, remember it. His focus was sharpened out of necessity. That's compensation learning.
And he chose litigation, courtroom work, rather than corporate law?
Right. Litigation often relies more on quick thinking, oral argument, remembering testimony, his strength, rather than poring over dense documents for hours, which would have been harder for him.
The source mentions him occasionally misreading words in court, like login for login.
Yeah, these little tells. But then contrasts it with his absolutely devastating cross-examinations, where his ability to recall tiny details from testimony hours or days earlier was legendary. That listening skill, honed by his difficulty, became a weapon.
So the difficulty forced a compensation that ended up being incredibly powerful, harder than just relying on a natural strength.
That's the key difference between compensation learning and capitalization learning. Capitalization is easy. You just lean into what you're already good at. Compensation is harder. You have to confront limitations, overcome insecurity, work harder. But the skills you develop can be unique and powerful.
We see this with Brian Grazer, too, the film producer.
Yeah, another story of dyslexia. Terrible grades in school, Fs mostly. But he said he had to develop other skills, planning, strategizing, negotiating, just to survive socially and academically. He called it really good training.
Okay, so these difficulties force adaptation. How does this relate to innovation?
Well, the source suggests innovators need a few key traits: openness, imagination, conscientiousness. But also, maybe surprisingly, they need to be disagreeable.
Disagreeable, like unpleasant.
Not necessarily unpleasant, but willing to challenge the status quo, to go against the grain, to take social risks, even if people don't like their ideas initially.
Not afraid to rock the boat.
Right. If you're too agreeable, too worried about pleasing everyone and maintaining harmony, you might shy away from truly disruptive ideas. George Bernard Shaw's quote fits here: "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man."
Okay, I get it. Who's an example of this disagreeable innovator?
Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA.
IKEA. How was he disagreeable?
Well, think about his decision back in 1961, height of the Cold War, to set up a major manufacturing partnership in communist Poland.
Wow, yeah, that was risky, politically and practically.
Hugely risky. Most Western businesses wouldn't touch that. But Kamprad was stubborn, maybe a bit of a micromanager, definitely willing to go against convention. And that decision was absolutely key to IKEA's ability to produce affordable furniture at scale. A disagreeable but brilliant move.
So his willingness to ignore convention, maybe born from his own unique perspective or challenges, was an advantage.
It seems so. And linking back to dyslexia, Brian Grazer talked about being labeled an idiot in school, having to do funny things to get by socially. That initial struggle, while painful, might also foster a certain resilience or willingness to operate outside norms.
And Gary Cohn, his dyslexia was severe.
Yeah, reading just 22 pages reportedly took him 6 hours. An immense struggle.
Yet he bluffed his way into a high-pressure Wall Street job.
As an options trader, yeah. He basically jumped in a cab with a managing director and talked his way into an interview, then into a job, without initially revealing the extent of his reading difficulty or his lack of specific knowledge at first.
That takes some nerve.
A lot of nerve? The source makes the point that most people, worried about failing or looking foolish, wouldn't have taken that risk. But Cohn, maybe feeling he had less to lose because of his struggles elsewhere, was more willing to be disagreeable, to take that huge social gamble.
Having nothing to lose can be freeing in a way.
It seems it can lower the barrier to taking risks.
Okay, the source then brings up remote misses. What's that about?
This comes from observations during the Blitz in London during World War II.
The bombing raids.
Right. Researchers noticed a phenomenon. People who experienced near misses, like a bomb landing nearby, shaking the house, but they survived unharmed, often didn't become more fearful.
They became what?
Often, they developed a sense of invincibility, increased courage, like they had faced the worst and survived, so nothing could really hurt them now.
There's that quote from the Londoner.
Yeah. Ever since we came out of the dugout, I have felt sure nothing would ever hurt us. It's this feeling of having conquered fear.
McCurdy's theory about being afraid of being afraid.
Exactly. That overcoming the fear of fear produces exhilaration and confidence. It's the very father and mother of courage.
There's even that crazy example of the guy bombed out twice who refused to leave London because he didn't want to miss all this.
It's an extreme reaction, but it illustrates the point. Surviving hardship, the remote miss, can fundamentally change your psychology, make you more resilient, perhaps even bolder.
So how does this connect back to things like dyslexia?
Well, dyslexia is a hardship. For some, it can be overwhelming, lead to negative outcomes. The source mentions higher rates in prison populations, for example.
A clear disadvantage.
Yes. But for others, like Boys or Cohn, surviving that difficulty, developing compensatory skills, acts like a remote miss. It builds resilience, maybe makes them more willing to take risks or challenge norms because they've already overcome something significant.
So the same disadvantage can lead down very different paths. It's not deterministic.
Not at all. Circumstances, support, individual response, they all play a huge role in whether a difficulty becomes desirable or debilitating.
This seems like a good transition to Dr. Emil Freireich.
Ah, J. Freireich, a fascinating, complicated figure, revolutionized childhood leukemia treatment.
But also had a difficult personality.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Brilliant physician, absolutely dedicated, but also known for a volcanic temper. Zero patience, saying exactly what was on his mind. Got fired like 7 times.
Wow. Yet people respected him.
Deeply loved and respected by many colleagues, despite the abrasiveness, and his work was groundbreaking.
What was the situation with childhood leukemia back then in the 50s?
Dire. Acute lymphocytic leukemia, the most common kind, was basically a death sentence, near 100% mortality.
And Freireich came in with a radical new approach.
Totally radical and incredibly risky, the VMP regimen. It involved using combinations of highly toxic chemotherapy drugs, hitting the cancer hard.
Which had terrible side effects, right?
Devastating. It wiped out the children's immune systems, leading to infections, bleeding. Some junior doctors thought he was genuinely insane, that he was harming the children more than helping.
But he persisted.
Relentlessly. He was incredibly hands-on, finding ways to manage the side effects, using combinations of antibiotics, which was considered heresy, then even figuring out how to administer drugs directly into the spinal fluid to fight leukemia cells hiding there.
What drove him to take such extreme measures?
The source points to the desperation. The kids were dying anyway. He famously said, "We had nothing to lose."
There's that phrase again.
Exactly. And the source subtly connects this back to his own difficult early life. His father died by suicide, his mother struggled. Maybe that experience, combined with his inherently disagreeable nature, made him uniquely willing to tear up the rulebook and try anything no matter how risky when faced with such a hopeless situation.
The adversity perhaps fueling the innovation.
It's a compelling idea that the person willing to take the necessary risks might be someone who's already familiar with hardship, someone less invested in the status quo.
This theme of nothing to lose also connects to the civil rights movement, doesn't it?
Yes, specifically the campaign in Birmingham, Alabama in the early 1960s.
Known as the most segregated city in America, Birmingham.
A truly dangerous place. The public safety commissioner was Eugene Bull Connor, a notorious aggressive segregationist.
And Martin Luther King Jr. decides to take the movement there. He knew the risks.
Absolutely. He told his team some of them might not come back alive. He gave mock eulogies before they went. He was clearly the overwhelming underdog in terms of conventional power.
But the source suggests he had a paradoxical advantage.
Yeah, stemming from that same history of hardship. The black community in the South had centuries of experience being outgunned, outmaneuvered, and learning how to survive and resist anyway.
This connects to the trickster tales, like Brer Rabbit.
Exactly. Those stories, Brer Rabbit constantly outsmarting the stronger Brer Fox, weren't just entertainment. They were survival guides, teaching lessons about using wits, cunning, and psychological understanding to overcome brute force. The weak often have to understand the strong better than the strong understand themselves.
So the disadvantage breeds a different kind of strength.
And it ties into the third desirable difficulty you mentioned. The unexpected freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. It allows the trickster to break the rules the powerful rely on.
Enter Wyatt Walker.
Ah, Walker, King's chief strategist, the nuts and bolts guy. Described as brilliant, intense, bit of a mischief maker. The Brer Rabbit to King's Mr. Leader.
And King basically tells him, create a crisis.
You've got to find the means to create a crisis, to make Bull Connor tip his hand. That was the assignment.
So Walker devises Project C for confrontation.
Right. A 3-act plan. Sit-ins at lunch counters, a boycott of downtown stores, and then mass marches designed to fill the city jails.
The goal wasn't necessarily to win those specific battles.
Not directly. The goal was to provoke Bull Connor into overreacting, to force him to show the brutality of segregation on a national stage.
But initially it didn't quite work. People were afraid.
Yeah, turnout for the marches was low at first. People were rightly scared of losing their jobs, or worse, the pressure wasn't building enough.
So Walker needed to escalate, to provoke Connor more directly.
And he knew Connor's obsession keeping protesters away from City Hall. So they marched towards City Hall. And Connor, predictably, reacted with force.
The police dogs, the fire hoses.
Used against peaceful demonstrators, including children and teenagers who joined the marches later.
And that created the image Walker needed.
The image, particularly a photograph of a young black teenager being attacked by a police dog. That picture went around the world. That was the crisis. It horrified people and galvanized support for the Civil Rights Act.
Walker basically played Connor.
He kind of did. He said later he was hoping Connor would try to stop them violently because that generated the publicity, the moral outrage. It's exactly like Brer Rabbit begging not to be thrown in the briar patch, the one place he actually wanted to go.
Using the opponent's own rigidity and aggression against them? Remarkable.
It really is. It shows how understanding your opponent's psychology and being willing to operate outside conventional rules because you have less to lose can be incredibly powerful.
Let's shift focus again to Northern Ireland and the Troubles. Another situation of deep conflict and power dynamics.
Right. Late 1960s onwards. Conflict between the minority Catholic community and the majority Protestant community, with the British Army involved.
The source mentions Rosemary Lawler's experience living in fear during the bombings and riots in Belfast.
And how the British Army, initially welcomed by some Catholics as protectors, came to be seen as an occupying force, especially after things like curfews were imposed.
There was this theory of counterinsurgency at the time. Leitz and Wolf.
Yeah, the rational actor model. It basically viewed influencing behavior, whether it's insurgents or criminals, as a kind of math problem. Apply enough costs, punishment, force, outweigh the benefits, and people will comply. It emphasized toughness, not sympathy.
But does that always work? The source uses a classroom example.
Right. A teacher who creates misbehavior through bad teaching or arbitrary discipline. It shows that the legitimacy of the authority figure matters hugely. If people feel the rules are unfair or the authority is disrespectful, they're less likely to comply, regardless of the punishment.
Legitimacy is key, not just force.
It applies to policing, too. Police Chief Joanne Jaffing in Brownsville, New York, a high-crime area.
What did she do?
Instead of just cracking down harder, she focused on building legitimacy. Visiting families of juvenile offenders, showing care, bringing Thanksgiving baskets. She understood that in communities where lots of people have been incarcerated, the law can easily be seen as the enemy, and you have to build trust first.
Okay, so back in Northern Ireland, the British Army initially took a hard line.
Yeah, during the tense marching seasons, they issued warnings like, gasoline bomb throwers will be shot. But this often just inflamed things, leading to retaliation from both the IRA and Protestant paramilitary groups. It wasn't building legitimacy.
And the Lower Falls curfew in 1970 seems like a key example of things going wrong.
Definitely. An army patrol finds some weapons in a Catholic area, okay? But then they linger, use tear gas despite a priest asking them to leave peacefully, provoking a riot.
And the response was massive.
Thousands of troops sealing off the area, house-to-house searches, ransacking homes, people getting hurt or killed by army fire. It created immense anger and resentment, driving more people towards the IRA. It backfired.
It seems like the more force is better, approach hit a wall, or worse.
It really suggests there's a limit, like an inverted U-curve. A certain amount of authority and force is necessary for order, but beyond a point, excessive force or punishment can actually decrease compliance and increase resistance because it destroys legitimacy.
This brings us to another incredibly difficult story. Wilma Dirksen,
whose 13-year-old daughter, Candace, was abducted and murdered in Winnipeg, a horrific tragedy.
And her response was very different from, say, Mike Reynolds, whose daughter's murder led him to campaign for the three strikes law in California.
Very different. Reynolds channeled his grief into advocating for much tougher punishment, more power for the state.
What did the Dirksens do?
After Candace's body was found, they faced the press. And instead of calls for vengeance, Wilma expressed a desire to understand the perpetrator, to share, hopefully, a love that seems to be missing in his life.
That's extraordinary.
And she added that incredibly humbling line. We have all done something dreadful in our lives or have felt the urge to, an act of radical empathy in the face of unimaginable pain.
The source is careful not to judge one response as better, right? Both parents acted from conviction.
Absolutely. Both showed immense courage. The key difference lies in their underlying beliefs about the effectiveness of power and punishment.
The Dirksens' background played a role.
Yes, they were Mennonites. A tradition emphasizing pacifism, with a long history of facing persecution themselves. Their cultural narrative included stories of resilience and forgiveness, not just retribution.
So their framework for responding to tragedy was different.
It seems so. While Mike Reynolds, and perhaps the British Army in Northern Ireland initially, operated under the assumption that applying more power, more punishment, would lead to positive change.
They might have been on the wrong side of that inverted U-curve.
Perhaps. Pushing too hard, whether it's mass incarceration under three strikes or heavy-handed military tactics, can potentially create more alienation, more resistance, making the problem worse in the long run by destroying that crucial legitimacy we talked about, like Joanne Jaffa realized in Brownsville.
The Amish tradition of forgiveness after the schoolhouse shooting is another example of a response outside that simple punishment framework.
Exactly. It suggests there are other ways to respond to harm, ways that don't rely solely on escalating force.
Which leads us finally to Le Chambon-sur-Lignon,
a small village in Nazi-occupied France during World War II. Poor, isolated.
And they did something amazing.
They became a haven for Jewish refugees, hiding thousands, mostly children, from the Nazis and the collaborating Vichy French government, led by their pastor, André Trocmé, and his wife Magda, but it was really the whole community.
They openly defied orders.
Openly. When Vichy officials demanded lists of Jews, they refused. The local police knew it was happening, but often looked the other way. Trocmé flatly told authorities they didn't know the meaning of the word Jew, only human being.
What happened to them? Surely the Nazis retaliated.
Surprisingly, not as severely as you might expect, given the scale of the defiance. Trocmé and his assistant pastor were imprisoned for a time for refusing to sign an oath of allegiance to Marshal Pétain.
Pétain, the head of the Vichy government.
Right. Trocmé told the prefect directly he couldn't swear allegiance because he disagreed fundamentally with Pétain's policy of handing over Jews to the Germans. An incredibly courageous moral stand.
What enabled this small, seemingly powerless village to do this?
The source suggests a few things. Their strong Huguenot, Protestant, faith, and history of being persecuted minority themselves played a huge role. They had a deep-seated commitment to conscience and helping the vulnerable.
And maybe Chakme's personal history.
Possibly. He had witnessed his own mother's traumatic death in an accident years before. The source hints that confronting great personal loss might build a kind of resilience, a different perspective on fear and risk. A sort of remote miss, perhaps.
It's like those who had already faced hardship were more prepared to act.
That seems to be the implication, that it was the marginal and the damaged, this poor village with a history of taking in outsiders who were most willing and able to resist evil, showing the limits of power and misfortune.
And the final thought connects back to David.
Yes, that much of what we value, much of what is beautiful or strong, comes from the shepherd, the overlooked, the underestimated, the one who finds strength and purpose in unexpected places.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the connecting thread through all these stories seems to be, well, things aren't always what they seem.
Exactly. Advantages can be disadvantages. Disadvantages can become strengths. Conventional power has limits, sometimes profound ones.
Hopefully, exploring these examples has given you, our listener, some food for thought about your own assumptions, about challenges you face or advantages you have.
Maybe the greatest strength isn't always overwhelming force or resources. Maybe it lies in that resourcefulness, that resilience, that moral courage born from difficulty or from the margins.
So maybe look around for the shepherds, the tricksters, the desirable difficulties in your own world. They might be where the real power lies.